It is September 25th, 1911, in the French city of Toulon, a major port city on France's Mediterranean coast, and a critical base for the Marine Nationale, or French Navy. In the Toulon roadstead are the battleships of the Mediterranean Squadron, and in their ranks is the battleship Liberté, or Liberty, as we're going to call her that for the rest of the video. Liberty was in the roadstead early in the evening of the 25th, when observers noticed smoke pouring from the moored ship. The smoke was concentrated around the starboard forward casemate, and the crew was seen to go to their action stations to combat the fire, but unfortunately for the crew, it was too late, as at 5:53 the battleship blew up with a horrendous explosion. In the disastrous loss of this French battleship, a total of 286 men and officers were killed, while 188 were wounded. The loss of Liberty was one of, if not the worst peacetime disasters of the Marine Nationale. Liberty, as I mentioned, was a part of the four-ship Patrie or Liberté class, depending on your source. John Jordan and Philippe Cresse, who I will draw heavily from in this video, tend to call it the country class, as I'm going to use the English translation here. Regardless, the ships were certainly a development from the pre-dreadnoughts of the late 19th century, with their pronounced tumblehome shapes and eccentric battery of guns. Granted, they were still armed with 4 305mm, 10 194mm, 13 65mm, 10 47mm guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. The different guns in their magazines will come into play later in our story, but Liberty was completed in 1908 and joined the Navy. She was assigned to the Mediterranean Squadron as the Italian Regia Marina posed a threat to French territorial claims in North Africa, as well as French control of the Western Mediterranean. She patrolled the waters of the Western Mediterranean until that fateful September day in 1911. Liberty sat in Toulon roadstead early in the evening of a beautiful early fall day near the other ships of the Mediterranean Squadron, when suddenly at 5:31 p.m. smoke was observed pouring out of the ship, and taking from a period source from the U.S. Navy's proceedings, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Earl in Volume 37 writes, "The weather was beautiful, and the ship had just started to swing to a light breeze on the starboard bow. Soon after reveille had sounded, and while the crew was scrubbing clothes on deck, as of escaping steam was heard together with a heavy sound or rumbling. This was at 5:17, and yellow acrid smoke with a powdered smell issuing by way of the ammunition hoist and ventilation pipes from the starboard forward 7.6-inch magazine was quickly followed by blue and then yellow jets of flame. These flames with thick and suffocating smoke filled the ship rapidly. The crew went to fire quarters quickly, Lieutenant Bignon in charge, and unsuccessful efforts were made to flood the magazines. The men endeavoring to do this were driven forward by this heavy, yellow, acrid smoke, possibly also the intense heat of the fire that had bent the operating gears of the flood valves. The chief engineer, in obeying a second order to flood the forward magazines, saying, "I've already tried," started forward again, but never returned. At about 5:27 to 5:35, time variously estimated within these limits, an explosion occurred under the foremast, sending a thick column of smoke, followed by flames. 3 other explosions followed at intervals, the first putting out all the lights on board, thus adding to the difficulty of controlling events. Assistance was signaled for and sent promptly by other vessels of the squadron. Lieutenant Garnier, apologies for the pronunciation, took charge at about this time. In an attempt to get the fires under control, and from the first-hand accounts, it seems like the fire was subsiding, and countermanded the flooding of the magazine, until he could learn more definitely the exact condition of the situation and to quiet the growing panic. However, the fire was most definitely not subsiding, as the interior of the hull was burning, and from time to time, jets of flame could be seen shooting from the foremast, these being caused by explosions of 65mm and 47mm ammunition. At 5:43, the crew was observed to have been rushing to their post, where to take from proceedings again. The call to quarters was sounded, and the crew went to their stations bravely, and even those who had jumped overboard in the first panic endeavored to reboard the ship to return to their stations. Water could not be obtained in sufficient quantity in fire hoses. The attempts to flood the forward magazines were failures. The whole inside of the ship was a furnace in which were burning all sorts of combustible material, bags, hammocks, linoleum, etc., and a thick smoke penetrated everywhere. The order was given to flood the amidships magazine, but the smoke and darkness rendered this impossible of accomplishment. The temperature between the decks rose rapidly. The order at last was given to abandon the ship. Then at 5:53, i.e. just 20 minutes after the first explosion, came the final and tremendous explosion, which converted the Liberty into a mass of shapeless and half-sunken debris. The roadstead was covered with wreckage, and the maelstrom caused by the explosion swallowed up many boats sent by other vessels to the rescue. The explosion was heard for over 30 miles. So the battleship exploded at 5:53, and taking from John Jordan and Philippe Cressy in French battleships of World War I, they write, "From the foremast aft, the decks collapsed towards the stern of the ship, and the two midships 194mm turrets were hurled over the after superstructures. The forward part of the ship was destroyed over a length of 55 meters. Only a part of the prow and the forecastle were found. Only one of the two 305mm guns belonging to the forward turret was discovered, protruding from the muddy bottom. Many members of the crew were trapped inside the spaces where they found themselves at the time of the explosion, and the flames which devastated the passageways and internal compartments left only charred remains. Some members of the crew threw themselves into the sea. Others prepared to launch the boats, but the speed of the events did not permit an orderly evacuation. An orderly evacuation could not have been ordered in the short amount of time between the fire starting and the destruction of the ship. In the disastrous explosion, a total of 286 men and officers were killed, while 188 were injured. Fortunately, 143 men were on leave in the city, sparing them from this disaster. Of these crewmen on leave, the captain of the ship was not on board that day. I think it's interesting to point out, due to the close proximity of the ships, there were other casualties and plenty of damage. For example, the battleship Republic was struck by a 37-ton piece of armor, killing 23 men, and a steel splinter sank a boat 700 meters away. The armored cruiser Marseille lost 15 men, St. Louis lost 9, Leon Gambetta 6, Suffren 4, and Democratic 3. More than 50 tons of explosives had reduced one of the frontline battleships of the French fleet to a total wreck. So the Marine Nationale needed to find the cause of such a devastating loss to the Navy. Wasting no time on the 26th, a committee headed by Rear Admiral Gascard made a thorough inquiry, and despite the ugly rumors as to socialism and malevolence, have reported as follows: that there was no trace of malevolence, that the supposition that a fire, either in the magazine or in adjacent parts of the ship, started decomposition of powder is disproved, and the spontaneous ignition of a charge in the forward starboard upper 7.6-inch or 194mm magazine was the source of the disaster, and no blame is to be attached to the officers or crew, all regulations having been complied with. So, with ruling out sabotage and the impossibility to flood the forward magazines at 5:31, there was only one thing the committee could turn to, an issue that had been known in the Marine Nationale: propellant charges. Taking from Jordan and Cressy again, the explosion was probably due to excessive heat in certain magazines and the constant handling of ammunition due to the number of refits. The propellant experts also declared that the current procedures in place for testing were insufficient for the monitoring of explosives. Once again, the inherent instability of powder B appears to have been responsible for multiple casualties. Previous incidents of fires had been recorded in several other French ships in 1896, 1900, and 1901. The official conclusions were as follows: the burning of the powder, which 20 minutes later exploded the shells and transformed the Liberty into a wreck, started in the 7.6-inch 194mm magazine, and not the 9 or 3-pounder magazine. That in this 7.6-inch magazine, there was no exercise, i.e. target practice, powders, all such having been expended at the previous target practice. The gunnery officer of the Liberty is very positive on this point, that the oldest B powder in this magazine dated only to 1906, and that the other lots of B powder were dated 1907, 1908, 1909, and 1910. All these lots carried the same mark, BM15AM8. I'm going to put up what that means on the screen now. That, therefore, the oldest B powder to which the explosion can be attributed was to but 5 years of age, and that, by deduction, powders of the B type, 5 or more years old, can spontaneously ignite. Well, the question that I'm thinking, and you probably are too, what changes did they make? I mean, besides the official ones stated in the conclusion. Well, they did go forward with the propellant changes, notably the limiting of powder of only 4 years old being allowed to be used, and no older, but changes to the magazine flooding arrangements were extremely minor and didn't amount to much. Interestingly enough, a month following the disastrous loss of Liberty, a fire broke out on Justice, and 294mm and 147mm magazines had to be flooded. In 1912, there were more fires in the Mediterranean Squadron. I think the loss of the Liberty to propellant fire is certainly interesting, and due to the time frame, I can't help but think about all the disasters we've covered in the Royal Navy in the First World War, particularly the dreadnought battleship Vanguard. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Do let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.